Joined now by the Labour MP Rushanara Ali, who's on the Treasury Select Committee, and Damien Green, the former de facto Deputy Prime Minister. Nice to have you both in the studio with us. Damien, let me ask you, what do you think needs to happen on Wednesday? Rishi Sunak has barely put a foot wrong on what he's done so far. Should he be emboldened to go much further along the same path?
Well, it's not so much on the same path, because you're right. He's done brilliantly at holding the economy together, and in particular holding people in their jobs. But obviously you can't do that indefinitely. We've got something like 9.5 million people furloughed and another couple of million self-employed people being supported. We now need to move on to a next phase of a different type of support, where he needs to make sure that as few jobs, as little unemployment as possible happens. Jobs will be lost. We've already seen big restaurant chains, for example, closing down. So we need to look forward to the jobs of tomorrow, and particularly, I think, in the short term, equip people with the skills to do that. So what...
Can I just ask you, jobs of tomorrow means people have got to accept they won't be doing these jobs anymore and retrain into something completely different? Is that what you mean?
Well, some won't, yes. I mean, we've got 3 million people working in hospitality. You'd like to think that we'll have 3 million people working in hospitality this time next year. That seems quite unlikely if you look around the streets now, and if you see, as I say, the number of restaurant chains, for example, that have gone broke. So, but there are jobs out there to be done, and I'm particularly pleased to hear that one of the pre-announcements, as it were, is going to be a green recovery, because I think that is one of the areas where there will be lots of jobs.
Rushanara, presumably there are a lot of progressive policies in what's been announced so far, not least the Green Deal, that Labour welcomes. I mean, this is your turf, this is your territory, isn't it?
Well, look, this is going to be the worst. This is the worst economic crisis for 300 years. And the question is the response in proportion with the scale of the challenge, the likelihood of 9% unemployment, 1 million young people facing unemployment by the end of the year? The answer is it's too early to say, but I very much hope the government has a radical plan that is of the scale that we saw after the Second World War.
What would radical mean to you?
Investment in a massive stimulus package, which is about protecting jobs and, of course, transitioning towards a green economy, towards green jobs. We've been calling for that for many years. In fact, what we saw is a retreat in terms of investment in the green economy. So we need to see that, but we need to see very significant investment, particularly, for instance, with young people. The government's put in... They're providing crumbs for young people.
Because Damien said, when you say protecting jobs, do you mean keeping people in the same jobs and propping them up, even if the sector is disappearing before our eyes? Or do you mean what Damien Green said, which is shifting them into whatever is the new industry?
Well, look, the transition to a new kind of economy will take time, and what we need to do is make sure that the job retention scheme isn't cut off immediately at the end of October, because actually that transition is going to take time, and we need to make sure people are not pushed off a cliff, which is what's going to happen by October if the government suddenly switches off the job retention scheme. So we're calling for making that sector-specific, protecting those people who are not going to be able to transition. I mean, no, not forever, but we need to make sure we don't force people into unemployment very quickly. If we want a so-called V-shaped recovery, which is a rapid recovery from this recession, then we are going to have to be much more bold and ambitious. And I don't see that happening at the moment. I very much hope we do. What I'm calling for is that the government should, for instance,
133 billion, you have to admit, is pretty bold this far, isn't it?
Well, the point is it bold enough for the scale of what's coming? Well, it's not clear it is.
Let me ask about furlough systems. This is something that Labour is behind, and actually many on the Conservative side too, who are saying it should be done sector by sector. If some sectors need protecting for longer, he shouldn't be scared of doing that, whereas what we know is it's going to end as we think in October.
You can make that argument, but the point you're getting to there is, I think, a key one, that if you are just keeping people in jobs that are not going to exist long term, then you're not necessarily doing them a favour by keeping them in a job that sort of doesn't really exist, rather than actually giving both them incentives to train and the money to allow themselves to train, and in particular giving employers an incentive, particularly for young workers, to take on new trainees to give them something useful to do in a job that will be here in 5 years' time.
I wonder whether you'd say that some of these jobs will be better off not existing. You know, if there are fewer planes in the sky, for example, if there are newer consumer practices, these are a different route into a lot of things that Labour's been asking for before, aren't they?
Well, look, we do need an entirely new way of thinking about how our economy is run and whether it's inclusive or not. If you look at the inequalities in our society, it's literally killed more people as a result of certain groups being hit harder because they're in much more vulnerable, fragile jobs, certain communities being hit harder. So we need a new settlement in what kind of economy we create, and that needs to be green jobs and other new jobs.
And they're going to do that settlement now.
They are not putting in the investment that's required. But let's just take young people. The government has announced today that it's going to create 10,000 more traineeships by giving employers £1,000 each. That is pie in the sky, considering actually it's 1 million young people. And I'm calling for the government to introduce a national youth corps similar to the post-war effort that was introduced in, like the civilian conservation corps, which is much more ambitious. And it would cost about £2 billion after savings. That's the scale of ambition we need to protect young people and give them the training and opportunities that's required.
The Conservatives,
it's not what's happening.
They'll never mention the word austerity again, will they? That won't be heard from a Conservative Prime Minister.
You have different policies at different times to cope with different problems. So just as in the 80s, it was important to drive through free market reforms. In 2010, the country was completely broke and austerity was appropriate then. What's appropriate now is the big build, build, build message that Boris Johnson has put forward, not just traditional infrastructure like roads and rail, but new infrastructure like broadband, plus all the things for individuals and for the sectors that will create the jobs of the future.
I want to just ask you...
Just to say, in the 80s, the Conservatives thought unemployment was a price worth paying, and Boris Johnson's got a lot of rhetoric about investing and talking about the Roosevelt era and New Deal and so on, but it doesn't match the reality, and that's what we need to see. We need to see much more dramatic investment.
Both of you, just to comment on what we heard from our political editor this evening, the Prime Minister saying we discovered too many care homes didn't really follow the procedures in the way that they could have after he was asked about the reason for the 20,000 fatalities. Can I just get your response to what you heard from the Prime Minister this evening?
I think it's disgraceful, and what it signals is a new frontier of a blame culture by the Prime Minister and this government, which is that it's other people's faults. The government and his government and he needs to take responsibility for the fact that care homes and our NHS struggled and continue to struggle with not having enough PPE, not having the support, not having the resources, and underinvestment over the last decade, and the audacity to blame care workers who have lost lives, who have sacrificed so much, is shocking. And I think it's got to stop, because what we're seeing is a new frontier of blaming everybody else. And what's going to happen is communities are going to be blamed next when these localised clampdowns happen. And that's a real worry, and it's got to stop.
Damien Green.
He clearly wasn't blaming care workers. He was making the point that it was difficult to know what the appropriate protocols were at a time when everyone was struggling with the early knowledge of this virus. And what really matters now is ensuring that as part of the rebuilding programme for the country, we do get on with improving the way we fund social care. Many of us have been arguing this for some time. That will be an important part, not just of the economic regeneration of this country, but also the social regeneration. It's absolutely a problem that needs solving in the next 12 months.
Thank you both very much, and thanks for coming in.